Facebook event from the Child Mind Institute called When to Worry About Your Child's Worry. My name is Dr. Rachel Busman. I'm a clinical psychologist and senior director of the Anxiety Disorder Center.
I am Elianna Platt, and I'm a clinical social worker in our Anxiety Disorder Center at Child Mind.
We're very excited to have you here today. Just a few words about the Child Mind Institute. We're a nonprofit organization and clinical practice dedicated to transforming children's mental health. So we're very excited to have you here today. We'll be very excited to receive your questions and answer them as they come up. So we're going to cover a few key topics today, including how to tell the difference between what's typical worries or typical anxiety and what's more a cause for concern. We will also give you some tips as parents or educators that you can use with kids. Hopefully you'll leave with some tips today, and also give you some tips for how to manage your own stress or anxiety, especially when dealing with worries in the moment. We will, as we said, take questions along the way, but let's get started by talking a little bit about what the fight and flight response is. It's very important when we talk about worries to talk about a really important mechanism that has kept us alive as a species for a long time.
Yeah.
So the fight or flight response is essentially what happens when something like this. You're walking down the street and a cab comes very quickly and almost clips you, and you jump back. You jump back very quickly. You don't think about what you should do in that moment. And you might notice that your stomach feels a little funny, and you might feel sweaty, and your heart might be racing, and you're probably thinking a bunch of thoughts in your mind, like, oh, that was close, or I'm going to be late to the office. But that's really your fight and flight response working very quickly. So when you're faced with a threat or a danger, your brain reacts very quickly and sort of bypasses rational thought and allows you to survive. What happens when you have fears or anxieties is that you can go into fight or flight even when there's no real threat or danger. So it's important to kind of keep that in the back of your mind, because everyone has the ability to fight or flee in the moment, and that's important as a species. So we'll talk just a little bit about what are some typical things that kids worry about, because they tend to change a little bit over time. So younger children might be afraid of the dark, monsters. Say that again?
That's a big one.
That's a big one. Monsters, the dark, things under the bed. Whereas older kids and teenagers might be worried more about social worries, or how they seem to others, or how they appear to others. So worries naturally take on sort of a developmental trajectory. And I'll also say, before I turn over to Elianna, that I think a lot of us have in our mind what anxiety looks like. We might picture a child hiding or crying or clinging to their parents, and that totally makes sense. But actually, anxiety can look disruptive as well, which means that if you're faced with something that feels really scary or terrible, you might try to leave the situation really quickly by running, maybe even barreling past the people in your way. And so a lot of times anxiety can be misinterpreted as bad behavior. And so we want to point that out.
That's a really good description, Rachel. And I think what we want to be thinking about, right? A big question that we have is, when do we know if our child is experiencing kind of typical anxiety, right? Everybody experiences it, as Rachel was saying, versus anxiety that's more of a cause for concern. So when you're asking yourself that question, there's 3 factors that we want you to be thinking about. The first factor is frequency. How frequently is your child experiencing their worries and fears? Is it a few times a month? That's not too worrisome. Or is it happening on a daily basis? That's a lot. That's something that you want to that's something that you want to pick up on your radar a little bit more. The second is duration. How long is this lasting? Is this lasting a few minutes here or there? Is it lasting for an hour, a couple hours? Is it lasting many days in a row? If it's lasting for many days in a row, that's something that's definitely more of a cause for concern if this is happening on a frequent basis. And the last piece that you want to be mindful of is impairment. And what that simply means is this anxiety getting in the way of my child doing his or her job? Now, you might be wondering, well, what is a child's job? They don't work. I work. But if you're wondering that, right, it's really not very complicated. A child's job is to play, develop relationships, try hard at school, engage at school. That's a child's job. And so when a child has a hard time doing any of those things, that's when we say, you know what, we got to take a closer look here. We may need to do some work. And we like to use a metaphor. We compare children that are experiencing more intense worries or more severe worries to having an overactive fire alarm. So a typical child, their fire alarm is going off when there's a fire, and then the fire's over and their fire alarm shuts back down. That's working really nicely. But for a child that's experiencing more severe worries and anxiety, their fire alarm is going when there's just a little bit of steam coming from the bathroom. And their fire alarm or smoke detector has a hard time resetting, so it might just keep going and going and going long after any kind of danger is over. And that's a really great way to conceptualize, okay, how is my child, what my child experiencing typical, or is it something that I need to take a closer look at or get some support with?
That's really great information, Elianna. I'll just mention that we will be taking questions along the way, and just as a technical point, I can't see the screen anymore over here. Sorry.
I'm just trying to make sure that we can.
But that was really great information. I'll also add that it's really important to get a sense of how your child is sleeping, eating, and behaving. So those are some really good sort of benchmarks for getting a sense of how your child is doing. So if you note that while you're also looking at some of the things that Elianna mentioned, if you also note changes to your child's sleep, changes in their patterns of eating or their behavior, that would be a cause of concern as well. This doesn't mean that if your child isn't a great sleeper, that that's necessarily a problem, but we're looking for more patterns of change. So I'm going to start with the first tip, and then we're going to take a first question.
Mm-hmm.
So the first tip, I think, is to be curious. So as a parent, it's really important to have a conversation with your child about what you notice, and to come to that conversation with a spirit of openness rather than assumptions about what you think. Mm-hmm. So for example, I'm thinking that back in school, math was not my favorite subject. So if your child looks worried about homework, you might make the assumption, maybe wrongly, that they're worried about math, because that's something that you experience. So it's important to come with openness without making assumptions, and actually say maybe something like, hey, you look really worried when you're doing your homework. What's up? That allows your child to know that he or she has an invitation to tell you more, and it allows you to sort of put aside your assumptions. So as I said, you might think that math is the concern when in fact they might be worried about making mistakes in general. And so timing is also really key. Finding a moment for having these conversations should be out of the moment of stress. So that means that you have to sort of prioritize your child and their worries, and say having a conversation with them at a time that they are not anxious is the most opportune time. During high anxiety, no one really thinks very well. I'm not very good at problem solving when I'm really tired or really hungry, and so it's really important to time your conversations. So I'm going to just look at a question saying, we're in a stomachache, headache mode right now with our 11-year-old son. We live near Parkland, Florida, and the anniversary of the shooting is coming up. He wants to be homeschooled, and the last 2 days he's been coming home with stomach aches. His anxiety is daily. I know he needs a therapist, and we have one. So I think this is a really great question, and this actually speaks to a couple of different things, right? So one is that kids who experience anxiety and adults who experience anxiety, not surprisingly, can feel it in their body. Yeah. That's actually a very real thing. Common. So it is very common to have stomach aches and headaches when someone feels anxious. And so it's important to pay attention to those and check in with a pediatrician around persistent stomach aches, persistent headaches, but also being aware that that's part of anxiety. Yeah. I think the fact that there's a trauma component potentially here, so that there's an anniversary of the shooting, which was a very devastating trauma, and that this particular person is writing from that area, it's not surprising that there would be heightened anxiety when someone has experienced the trauma or even vicariously experienced the trauma. Yeah. So I think the fact that you found a therapist is amazing, and making sure that that therapist is not only assessing the anxiety, but assessing for potential post-traumatic stress disorder, depending on how distant or close the child was to the particular event. Yeah. Homeschooling, I think, could be a whole nother conversation. So there are a lot of pros and cons to homeschooling, and I think it's beyond this to address it fully, but just to say that we'll talk later about the fact that one of the ways to get over some anxiety is actually to face things that are challenging rather than avoid. Yeah. And so we often worry about adults or children sort of withdrawing from a particular situation, which actually can unintentionally reinforce anxiety. Yeah. And we do want to be able to send a message that going to school is generally safe, and that adults are there to make sure that the child is safe.
Yeah, and I think you touched on a point which leads into our next topic, which is kind of talking about the tip of practice, right? Practice is a really important thing to do with your child that is experiencing fear. And like Rachel said, after you've had that conversation and have been curious and asked your child, okay, and identified what is it that my child's really anxious about, once you've identified that, that's when you want to start setting up times where you can actually start practicing that thing as opposed to avoiding it. Because when we avoid it, right, the fear gets a lot bigger. So an example of practice could be something like if your child has a phobia or a fear of dogs, you wouldn't want to just cross the street every time your child sees a dog, because then likelihood is that fear would get bigger. Instead, what you want to do is come up with times where your child could see a dog, but maybe in a more contained setting. So maybe on a leash or behind a cage. Not throwing them into a dog park and saying like, hey kid, fend for yourself. That would be too much. But doing it in a contained way so that it's manageable for them and they can get through it. And when we kind of call practice experiences, we call that exposure. And what that simply means is it's just a fancy word for saying doing anything with your child to face their fears rather than avoid their fears. And when you are going to do this with them, you want to make sure that you've talked to them about it beforehand.
For sure.
Don't just want to spring it on them. And what that might look like is a short conversation, just saying, honey, I know you told me that you're feeling nervous about dogs, and that's totally normal. We're going to start doing some bravery practice with it. So we're going to start practicing getting used to being around dogs. And if your child has questions, you can go into more details to explain that to them, but it doesn't have to be a very long conversation. You do want to give them the heads up and notice.
So I think it's important to, as Elianna was saying, is to really give a rationale, right? Because it actually makes a lot of sense to stay away from things that feel uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. So maybe an adult-related fear or worry might be taking the subway. Yeah. And so it's very easy to find a lot of reasons why not to go on a subway. For example, I can walk, or it's more pleasant to take a car. But if someone had a fear of subways because of the crowds or because a subway car could stop in between subway stations, it makes sense that we as humans are motivated to stay away from things that are anxiety provoking. Unfortunately, that doesn't help get over the fear of subways. Yeah. And so actually the idea would be to slowly and systematically approach rather than avoid that situation. So as silly as it sounds, it might mean going to subway stations, going down the steps, and not even getting on the subway as an adult, or even taking it one stop to practice that this is hard and I can do it. And that's what we want to convey to kids. So we'll give a couple of examples, and I think this is going to touch on a question that's coming up about sleep. So if for example, if your child needs you to sit with them at homework time because they have a lot of questions and they feel nervous to do it on their own, and we're trying to think of first steps. One first step would be to say, I'm going to sit with you, but I actually have some work to do. Whether that means you actually physically have work, or you're checking your mail, or you're returning emails. And the instruction would be, Elianna, you sit and get started with your work, and I'm going to be over here. And we're going to set a timer that you're going to have 10 minutes before you're going to start to ask questions. Similarly, we see a lot of kids with sleep difficulties, and it's not uncommon for children who have anxiety to have anxiety at bedtime. And if you think about it, that's the time you're saying goodbye to your parent for the longest time of the night, and it can be really scary. And so it's not uncommon for parents to tell us they have to lay down with their child to go to until they fall asleep, or that they have to lay on the floor or sleep with them. And so I love cuddle time. I love to cuddle with my son every night. That's not the best time to do it when you're trying to help kids fall asleep on their own and manage being independent in their own bed. So when children have anxiety about sleep, I will often say something like, start small. Something like, if a parent is in the bed with the child, I'll start by saying, get into a chair next to the bed and maybe even put your hand on the child, but you're doing this more consistently and saying, this is a time for sleep, it's not cuddle time, but I'll be here. And then slowly moving the chair maybe every few days depending on the severity of the anxiety.
Let's see if that addressed ours.
So we have another question.
Okay.
Do you want to read this one?
Yeah. I have a 12-year-old who has overcome selective mutism. Her younger sister is now showing signs of anxiety. She'll answer questions as short as possible with adults, but isn't initiating. How shy is too shy? How do I know if she's just reserved or if anxiety is getting in the way?
What a great question.
That is a really good question. So something that you want to be thinking about is, right, that impairment piece that we talked about. Like, is it just kind of in some social situations that she's not talking, or is this preventing her from doing her job as a child or as a budding adolescent? How old is she?
She's a younger sister.
Okay, got it. So is this getting in the way of her developing relationships at school? Is this getting in the way of her performing at school, of her being able to advocate for herself and say, I need help?
Right.
So those are all things that you want to be thinking about when you're wondering, is this just shyness or is this more than that?
And I also would just add that because we know that family history or genetics has a component, certainly it's not all genetics, meaning you can have one child who has anxiety and another child in the family who absolutely doesn't. It's not uncommon to see siblings or twins who one has social anxiety or one has SM or another kind of anxiety. So I think, we think about shy, and shy is different than selective mutism.
Yeah.
So shy is really sort of a temperamental style, but kids who are shy tend to warm up.
Yeah.
A child who has selective mutism is really exhibiting restricted speech in different settings.
Yeah.
So it's important to keep in mind.
To differentiate. Okay, maybe we'll move on to our next tip, and then we'll take our next question.
Yes, and then we'll take a next question.
So we're talking about practice, and Rachel gave some really good examples of practice. There's a few strategies that you can use when practicing with your child that will help it be more successful. The first one is being really specific about what you're about to do. So giving a clear direction. If you are helping your child become more independent during homework, then giving them a clear direction during practice time of, go ahead and open up your notebook while I sit over here for the first 10 minutes and you get your work started. Or go ahead and get into bed if you're helping them get into bed independently. Go ahead and pet that dog. Those are really good, clear, specific instructions that will help your child understand, okay, we're in practice mode, this is what mom or dad is expecting of me. Another really important strategy is thinking about how you're going to motivate and reinforce your child throughout this. A lot of children are not self-motivated to go and do the things that they're really afraid about, which is normal. And so because of that, we want to be using some strategies like one, we call it labeled praise, which is really just a way of saying that we want to be giving our children specific targeted praise for whatever they're doing. And what that could look like is if your child is afraid of dogs or is afraid to start homework on their own, honey, that was a really great job opening up your notebook all on your own. I'm really proud that you started this all by yourself. Or I'm really impressed that you got into bed all by yourself without me even having to remind you.
And sometimes that can seem like that's overdoing it, or
right.
Like
babying.
Are we babying our child? Are we praising kids to death? And I think that that's not the case. I think that it's really important from a behavioral perspective to follow up a behavior that you want to see more of with specific praise so that happens.
Yeah.
And I think for older kids, you certainly wouldn't say to a 12 or 13-year-old, great job getting your notebook open, but you might have a mechanism for letting them know, like, I know this is really hard and you're working, like, you're really working on that. I really appreciate it even though it's challenging.
Right, like, well, I'm just impressed that you opened that up on your own, or that was really mature of you.
Yeah,
Those
exactly.
are all, you can change tone and language for different ages so that it still feels reinforcing for them.
Rewards, and then I'll take the question.
Yes. Final piece is that rewards can be really helpful for a lot of kids, and it doesn't have to be monetary. So setting up a system like, hey, every time you start homework on your own for the first 10 minutes, that means you get an extra story at bedtime, or maybe an extra 15 minutes of screen time that night. Or extra dessert. It depends on what you guys decide
And
to do.
we've never seen in all the many kids we've treated a child get dependent on rewards. Because what ends up happening is that as something becomes easier, you can fade the rewards.
Right, you titrate it.
I really want to address this question because it's really important. So advice for teachers and parents who have anxiety or even PTSD themselves, how they can help children with anxiety while managing your own. So this person was reading our mind because it's something we're going to talk about later, but I think there are two things. One is we have to, as parents and adults, model what we call non-anxious coping. And that sometimes means even when you're having an anxious moment on the inside, you're modeling a sense of, this is hard and you can do it. Because actually kids are very savvy and pick up on anxiety, they pick up on parent discord, they pick up on the tone of things. And so it's really important to be able to share with your child moments that you've overcome things, and I use sort of mild moments. tend to feel like kids should not be privy to some more details of their parents' lives, because that's probably oversharing.
Yeah.
But things like, coming home, I frequently will say, I was so frustrated today. The train had only 6 cars and it was supposed to have 8, so it was extremely crowded, and I felt very squished. I felt kind of angry, and then I would explain how maybe I used a strategy to keep myself calm. I think that for parents or teachers who are aware that they have their own anxiety or diagnosed PTSD, it's really important to take care of yourself through more informal methods of self-care, but also being in treatment. And there's some excellent treatment providers. There are resources on our website at childmind.org. There are a lot of other resources for national organizations like ADAA, that's a Depression and Anxiety Association, and other more specific ones, because we can only be as helpful as we can if we're taking care of ourselves. And it's really important to do those things.
Yeah. Agreed.
So I just want to talk a little bit about something called reassurance.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very likely that you reassure your child. I reassure my child.
Mm-hmm.
You probably reassure your child.
It's hard not to.
It's really hard not to, because we're parents.
Yeah.
And our children only have the ability to really send a distress signal to us when they're upset or they're anxious or distressed, right? Kids are sort of learning how to take care of themselves, but they're not fully independent. So it's not uncommon to have questions like, what time are you going to pick me up? Well, what time again? Are you sure you're going to be coming to that exact location? And so telling your child the answer to one question, I consider that giving information.
Yeah.
But I think everyone knows when a child's questions become moving into the land of reassurance seeking.
Right.
And I think what ends up happening is the function of reassurance is, Elianna says, so what time are we going to have lunch? And I tell her. But then it only settles her for a few seconds before she asks me again.
Right.
And by me like a binky.
Yeah.
So by me telling her, it doesn't really teach her the fact that, you know what? We talked about when we're gonna have lunch.
Mm-hmm.
And you can actually sit with the discomfort of not knowing, because that's really what anxiety is sitting with a level of uncertainty and being able to manage that things can be uncertain, and I as a parent or a coworker don't have to completely smooth that away.
Yeah.
And this goes back to sort of this idea of daily practice, which Elianna talked about before, and that it really takes practice. So back to the example of sleep is a perfect example, that it's unlikely if a child has been sleeping with a parent or have the parent in the bed or some permutation of that for months and months or even a year, that behavior is going to be practiced one time and it's going to be smooth sailing.
Yeah.
In fact, it probably needs many, many, many repetitions of that.
Especially with sleep.
Especially with sleep.
So much repetition.
And especially with reinforcement. So a chart, or with reassurance rather.
Yeah.
So a chart with progress can actually be really helpful, so that kids and adults can be reminded where the progress has been.
Yeah, and you were saying that if practice doesn't make perfect, it's practice makes better.
Yes,
right?
because practice does make better, because I don't believe in perfection.
Right.
I think we should strive to
We're
be
just striving to make change
and be imperfect.
Yeah.
So Elianna's going to talk about being a model, and I'm
Yes.
going to look to the next question.
Yeah, so being a model is kind of what Rachel touched on a little bit before in our addressing our last question, but that's just simply that when you are in a practice situation, you want to be modeling for your child what you want to see from them. So it's a lot easier to say, go ahead and do it, but really what you want to be doing with your own behavior is doing it first, showing them, hey, you can handle this, I can do it too. So if your child's afraid of a dog, going over and starting to pet the dog first before telling them to do it is a really great way to model approach behavior. If you are to be doing that, right, you wouldn't want to be saying something like, honey, this is easy. This is fine. It's not a big deal. Come on over. It's not a big deal. Because then you're also devaluing what they're experiencing, and they're experiencing real legitimate fear.
Right.
So we want to be showing them that we get that. But what you could be saying during that moment is, I'm petting this dog. Oh my gosh, his fur is so soft. He's licking my hand. He's sniffing me. All of those things, and all those statements are just showing your child that, okay, it is okay. Mom's or dad is petting the dog and it's fine, and maybe I can do it too. So modeling for your child what you want to see from them is really important.
Very important. So this is a really good question that I think will be relevant to a lot of people. So I have a teen with severe anxiety and long-term school refusal. There doesn't seem to be much help near me, and I'm nowhere near New York City. Any suggestions other than full homeschooling? Yes. So I think, just for those who might not be aware of what school refusal is, as it sounds, children who are not able to go to school, I think refusal probably sends the message that it's potentially a child is like a delinquent and not wanting to go to school, but kids don't go to school for a variety of reasons, and often related to anxiety, like social anxiety or depression, which is not anxiety, a mood disorder. And what ends up happening is staying away from school, much like my subway example, becomes very reinforcing, meaning it feels a lot safer and a lot more comfortable to be home. What I would say to someone who is not in New York City is that we at the Child Mind Institute and many other places across the country do something called intensive treatment, which can look like coming to a center or having clinicians come to you and do what's called intensive treatment, where it would involve a week or more of treatment sort of compressed in a smaller amount of time to address some very severe concerns. So I would say that if someone is ready to do homeschooling, I would really want to make sure that they've exhausted the other options for treatment. Obviously homeschooling is a choice, and that's great if that works for your family, but if it's because of anxiety, I would want to say that there are many places across the country that treat kids with anxiety in different places of the country, and also places that offer something called intensive treatment.
And intensive work is really beneficial because it's because of the dosage. So it's just a lot at once, and so what we see is we can see really great gains with a child that gets made over a very short period of time because they're just getting this repetitious practice.
Right. So I think that we're almost out of time. I think we'll just kind of summarize a few key tips, which is anxiety is really normal. Fears are normal. And they change over time. So kids that are younger can be afraid of things like monsters in the dark, and kids that are older, it tends to fit more with things that teens are worried about. Social relationships, things like that. When to know if something is a concern is Elianna did a great job of saying frequency of symptoms, how long, so duration and impairment, right? The other thing is if you're feeling like taking on some bravery challenges on your own, start small, small and systematic, and using rewards along the way is super helpful. And what else would you add in terms of?
Just daily forms of just baby steps. It's all about baby steps and identifying the baby steps where you think that they don't exist.
Exactly. Really and I think I'll leave everyone with a phrase I've been using a lot, which is especially around sleep or certain fears. Likely if something's been going on for a while and you say like, today's the day or tonight's the night, we're just gonna have the child's gonna sleep in their own room, or they're just gonna go to a play date with a huge German Shepherd, like that's a setup for an unsuccessful exposure. So tonight's the night is not a really good mode. It should be small and systematic and rewarding along the way. So we so appreciate you being with us at your lunchtime and sending in your questions. And we hope
really great
very great questions. And we hope to see you again in our next Facebook Live, and visit our website at childmind.org for more resources. Thank you. Bye.